Hello everyone, welcome to another Musing On episode. So this one is part of, I suppose, thematically, a series of videos I've been doing under the Musings On banner about programming languages. And it's a direct follow-on from the two I've done for the 1990s. I said I was going to do other decades, so I figured let's have a look at the 1980s in this video. I'm only going to do one video this time round because when I drill down and talk a little bit around the programming languages from 1980 that I had a personal relationship with at some point, there's actually fewer to talk about than the 1990 period or decade in the 1990s, where for those videos I actually split them into two. However, there is going to be a follow-up episode to this, but for, well, same thing, programming languages, but not specifically about the 1980s. So I'm going to just talk about, what I've set in motion in order to do that video, or why the follow-up video is going to come about. So for ages now, I've been looking for a sort of worthy successor to my rather ancient book on comparative programming languages, which I think I did a My Life in Objects or Things That Spark Joy episode way back. And I've always been really interested in, what makes programming languages similar, what makes them different, commonalities that you can sort of learn, and patterns that you can learn that make learning other programming languages both easier and in some ways more exciting. And I finally think I found it. So I've ordered this book and I'm going to do a video when it arrives. We're doing a little unboxing and flick through. But I thought I'd just show it to you before I get into talking about languages from the 1980s, because it's a really interesting book. And like I said, I've looked at a number of different comparative programming languages book that are similar to the original one I own, but they're a bit too technical for me, and they're a bit too concerned with, I suppose, or aimed at an audience that may be interested in creating like compilers and stuff like that. And there's a few that have been close, but this one just ticks so many boxes. This is the original GitHub page for the first edition. Now, one word of warning here. My understanding is, if you look at this, so the languages that are shown here are mentioned in the book, are mentioned in the original version, but some are mentioned in more detail than others. So if we look at the first edition of this, and I'll come on to the second edition in a moment, you can see it's got chapters dedicated to JavaScript, CoffeeScript, Lua, Python, Ruby, Julia, Java, Clojure, Elm, Erlang, Go, Swift. And then the additional languages are covered in chapter 13. And then there's sections in Rust and C which discuss explicit things to do with the language. But clearly, the first 12 chapters or chapters 1 to 12 have whole sections on particular languages. Now, the one I've ordered is obviously the most recent one. It only just came out this year, actually, as second edition. And if we just go quickly into the preview, because I just wanted to show the layout of this book as a sort of spoiler alert, I suppose. I'll go through the book properly once it arrives, but this is the first so many pages here. So this gave me a better idea of how this is broken down. So your first chapter looks like 14 pages, and then going through you can see each language has got about 15, 16 pages on it, maybe more. And it goes through and you can see, based on what the language is and the sort of things that it might do under the bonnet or when you're programming in it, you can see there's sort of subtle differences in terms of what they might cover. So it's JavaScript, TypeScript, Python, Ruby, Java, so Kotlin. So it looks like it's covering similar bases to the first edition. Got Julia, Clojure, Haskell, Go, C, and clearly here, we've got some expanded chapters on languages that were probably originally in this additional languages list. So, so we go chapter 14 Swift. We got Rust here. Looks like it's got its own dedicated chapter now. And then we've got these additional languages. So, few sections on the classics, and then other languages that fall into different categories. Interesting how they've categorized these as well. So if you notice, they don't seem to be categorized necessarily by programming paradigms, but sort of grouping them together in types of languages. Even a little bit on IO, which is cool, which was one of the languages in the 7 languages in 7 weeks. Erlang and Elixir are covered in concurrency. And then there's a section on quantum computing languages. Interestingly, not very large. So this looks like this might be all condensed together. Interesting when I get the book to see how this is laid out. And then esoteric languages. I actually have a separate book on esoteric languages, so I wasn't too worried about that. And then assembly languages. So it looks like the sections are reasonably brief in some instances, and the total book is just under 400 pages. And then you can see here this is just showing you the preface here, an interesting table here that has a layout here of the sort of things that are covered. And there's a whole GitHub for supplementary materials. But yeah, I thought it'd be interesting to show if, like me, you are interested in the sort of comparative study of programming languages. And that's really the reason why I like to learn different languages. I'm not doing it to tick stuff off a list or necessarily to go down a particular programming paradigm rabbit hole, although there is a little bit of that interest. But it's more to look at the commonalities and the differences between languages, because that just does really fascinate me. And I think I've said before, like the coding shapes as well, the way certain languages look on the page. Yeah, so it looks like I'm going to enjoy this from what I've seen already. Sections about literals and variables and explaining sort of overarching concepts that are, true in various degrees to all languages, although they may be manifested and implemented in slightly different ways within the language. So yeah, really looking forward to that. So that should be coming soon, and I will do a book opening for that one. Awesome. Okay, anyway, back to the 1980s in programming. Well, it was relevant to some of the languages I'm going to be talking about. So I'm just going to go down the timeline here just to orientate ourselves in 1980 to see if we can see a basic pattern, and then I'm going to talk about individual languages. Now, one of the things that's going to massively affect this discussion is the fact that there are so many dialects of BASIC that were coming out in the 1980s. So we've got ones on the Apple machine. So by then we've got the Apple II, QBasic. We've got Smalltalk. Now, I should actually talk about that. So let me put that up on the timeline. So we've got BBC Basic, IBM Basic A, and it's PostScript, GW Basic here, which I'm going to talk a little bit about, Turbo Pascal, which I will mention in passing. And then we've got Ada 83, came out in 1983. So you'll notice several of these languages, do in their name, as opposed to having version numbers, have the actual dates when that version of the language came out. I do have a book on Ada, but I've never really got into it properly. That's one on my list. Now, interestingly, we have here Objective-C as well, which I've seen on a few lists. And going back here, C with classes, which became C++. And there's C++. And more basic, see QBasic. We have Lisp becoming Common Lisp, or a dialect of Lisp. And there are several different dialect of Lisps and much more modern dialects as well, which I'm sure once we get up to covering other decades, the 2000s, the 2010s, we will come up against those. It mentions fourth there. I will be talking about that when I get around to covering 1970s. Standard ML, it's a modular programming language. Then we have QuickBASIC, so another variant of BASIC. Eiffel here, object-oriented programming language. And also it's interesting to see what these are inspired by or based on. More basic. We've got one of these so-called 4GL programming languages. So with 4GLs, so my understanding is with that, it's basically programming languages that are based in or contained within some sort of relational database system. And then the language is used to do additional programming, or has additional programming capabilities beyond what you could achieve simply by using SQL. And it can take a lot of different forms. Now, my trip, if you like, into full-time professional programming that wasn't an adjunct to doing something else. So I've done a lot of programming where it's been part of another job. But the one time that I did, 100% software engineering, and that was all I did, 9 to 5, well, more than 9 to 5, and more than 7 days a week for a period of time. And that was in a 4GL. So it's just reminded me of that, actually. And that was something called Concord XAL. But of course, if you've had exposure to, say, Access using VBA, you can get some idea of what a 4GL's like. Because, with Access, you've got a database system. You have some ability in Access to do various forms of SQL, but additionally you can use VBA to do more programming language or other programming language stuff that you wouldn't be able to do, say, in a script, in a query language. We've got a few variants of Pascal this year, and we have Erlang, which I'm going to talk a little bit about in a moment. More Ada. So the other thing you might notice with programming languages, you might see references to ISO standards as well. So there might be like an ISO standard version of a language. And we have Self, which is inspired from Smalltalk. Here you can see it's just concept. And then Self itself went on to inspire other languages. We have Perl. And again, I will talk a little bit about that in a moment. And then Oberon here. So there's a number of languages that are attributed to Nicholas Worth. I'm trying to remember what he's had a hand in now, actually. Oh, there you go. And you'll notice there's a few people like that who are associated with more than just one language over the years. More basic stuff. There's TCL here as well. I tend to forget about that. So you'll notice there's several languages here that are linked to Awk in some way. And also other languages which have a link back to Smalltalk. Back to Rex. We have something called A+, and the reference here to APL. I'm sure I'll talk about that at some point. Turbi Pascal OOP, Modular 3, Power Basic, and down here we have Bash. So let's loop back and muse on some of the things that I do want to specifically drill down through and try and relate sort of personal stories to. So sometime in the mid-90s, I was doing a postgraduate diploma in computing and manufacturing. Some elements of the course were more in the area of process improvement and implementation of both technology and other things. And so they were very much in the areas of quality control, quality management, project management, implementing new technologies. But then I did other units on relational database management, Smalltalk, object-oriented programming using Smalltalk, and knowledge-based engineering or knowledge-based analysis and design. So there were elements of like multi-use or multi-use courses which had had their roots in quality improvement and process improvement, and then other things that obviously were process improvement techniques but were associated more with programming languages specifically and databases. And I did a course in Smalltalk. So that was really my only exposure to Smalltalk. I've never used it since. And it's one of those languages where I suppose it's a good one to teach the concept of object-oriented programming because that's all you can do. There's no sort of cheating and programming without objects that you can do in some languages. So it's a pure object-oriented programming languages. So you have to do that. So that's why at the time they were using it to teach object-oriented programming, because it forced you. And the other thing is as well, it had a whole set of tools with it, because we learned about object-oriented design as well. So there was, I think, what do you call it, like a wireframe toolkit we were using. So it really did force you to think in objects exclusively. And I found it useful because so many other languages have sort of been built on this. But yeah, it was hard, like to have, when you're coding, you've got no outs. I always have to stop myself sometimes, like when I'm working in like a multi paradigm language, that maybe there is a way in it which I should be programming, or maybe there's a what's that term I'm trying to think of now, where you say something is Pythonic, don't you? Oh God, idiom. That's it. So there's certain languages where there's certain idioms that you should follow, but they don't necessarily enforce it. So what tends to happen is you go in it thinking, yeah, I'll try and stick to this, and you get stuck and you go off on a bit of a tangent and try and code in a way that's allowable in the language, but doesn't really play to the idiom. Whereas in Smalltalk, you don't really have a choice. It's interesting, the most loved programming languages in 2017. It was not among the 26 most loved programming languages in 2018. It's funny how that happens on those Stack Overflow ones. There was that weird year where every other year Clojure had been like the best paying language, and it just like drops off out of the top 25 or whatever suddenly, and then comes back again the following year. Not quite sure what happened there. But the language or variants thereof that I've probably used most over the years has links to this, and I did use this as well. So QBasic is what shipped with Microsoft or with DOS for quite a number of years, up to, well, say quite a number of years, basically up until DOS 5, where it's taken by QBasic. But it gets muddy, and we'll talk about this in a moment, why it's sort of a little bit murky as at the point at which QBasic actually becomes available and takes over from QBasic, because of a similarly named interpreter and compiler package which you had to go out and buy. So QBasic came as part of DOS. And so initially, when I was programming in DOS programming on DOS PCs, it would have been QBasic that I used. Now, prior to that, I had to program in the variant of BASIC that's on Apple IIs, but for a relatively short period of time. And then before that, I'd been programming in the dialect that was on the Commodores, so Commodore BASIC, both on Commodore PET, and I don't know if anybody remembers the Commodore Plus 4, which was a sort of dialed back version of a Commodore 64, but it had some packages on it, like a spreadsheet and a few other things. So yeah, this was really the language in which I started developing programs for use in a business environment, and would have been writing what's the word I'm looking for here? Would have been writing process improvement programs over a number of years. But over time, and when we got up to DOS 5, obviously when that carried on in later years where I was still dabbling in BASIC on DOS systems, I would have switched over to QBasic. Now, this comes out in 83. Okay, so also we have Turbi Pascal, which comes out in 83. So I started doing a lot of programming on DOS machines for business reasons around about, I've got to go back in time here, so when would be 93, 91, so between I think 87 to 89, 87 to 89, 89 to 91, 91 to 90, yeah, so 87 to 89, somewhere around there, I started doing a lot of QBasic programming. The reason I brought up Turbo Pascal is it's important to the discussion. So at the same time, a little whiles after that, I was tasked to not migrate's not a really good word for this, but develop a version or stripped down version of software that was running on some machines running CPM with Pascal or Turbo Pascal, I think. And in order to do that, I needed to understand the algorithms that the programmers had written. There were certain identification algorithms to do with probability analysis for identifying bacteria, for identifying gut bacteria. And as a consequence, I needed to work out how they were doing the math. I knew what the underlying math was because someone I had worked with had given me a series of papers about bacterial identification and the underlying mathematics behind it. So I understood the mathematics. I just needed to see how they'd implemented that because they were using certain thresholds and additional coding to do statistical analysis on clusters of I'm trying to think of the correct term here, but there was a probability component which was purely based on whether something had triggered a certain chemical reaction, if you like, a certain test was positive or negative. But then once that data was analysed and a number of possible identities were identified, there was an additional calculation done to establish whether it was groups of bacteria that overlap in terms of I'm trying to think of the term here that's correct to use, but basically it was looking for overlapping in populations. So if you can imagine it on a two-dimensional graph, it looks like a series of sort of circles and you're getting overlaps on circles, and there was a mathematical way of doing that. And there was some cut-offs as well that had certain classifications based on whether the competing identities overlapped with one another. So those sort of things going on. And all of that was contained and written within Pascal code. And so as a consequence, I had to take the original source code and, interpret it. That's basically to buy a book on Pascal and then convert it into BASIC. Now, at that point in time, I'd acquired the firm had paid for this thing called QuickBASIC, which is Microsoft's IDE, which has their compiler. So loosely based on QBasic, has additional types, programming structures, better graphics, all sorts of things, and the presence of a compiler. And that came out in 85, but I didn't use it until sometime in, I would say, so 87, but from about probably 88, 89 onwards, from that point onwards. And once I started using this, there was no need to use QBasic anymore. Now, what's interesting is subsequently, when I left the firm but was still dabbling in DOS, what Microsoft started doing is instead of shipping DOS with QBasic, they shipped it with QBasic, which was basically QuickBasic with the compiler taken out. That's one way of thinking about it. So yeah, QBasic replaces QBasic as the packaged interpreter in MS-DOS, but there's this version, a version of BASIC where you can compile to an executable called QuickBasic, which is still around and has origins from a lot earlier. Because if you look at when QBasic started coming out, it's 91. so a lot later. So yeah, if you bought versions of DOS at that time, then you'd start to see QBasic come in and GWBasic go away. And yeah, most of the coding I did for quite a number of years between 87 to 93 over 3 separate jobs, although they were all revolved around the same area, which was quality control. Involved the use of GWBasic stroke QuickBASIC stroke QBasic. Now, in between QBasic and QuickBasic coming out, we have C++, which is, I think, as I pointed out, if you look at the timeline, so it's ultimately what C with classes became. And I have the book for this, the classic book. And really that's my only exposure to C++ is through going through the book and dabbling with it. I'm having trouble remembering if I ever wrote anything in C++. I think possibly, I know I've written one program in C, and of course you can write stuff in C and then compile it in C++. But with the, with certain compilers, I mean, with the modern ones, I'm assuming well, I must admit it's a while since I've actually dabbled in C++ in a degree, so it'd be interesting to see, whether it is still, I suppose, what you would call, the natural progression of C with classes. So I'm assuming if you just write C++ without classes, which essentially is C, it'll just compile no problem at all, because underneath it, under the bonnet, it's all goes back to C. And so the one time you see C with classes, the one time I've ever written anything, I got a feeling, or close to C++, actually it was written in C. I think most back then as well, you tend to just see it as expressed as C stroke C++. Anyway, so, but it was some sort of, I had a program to do a quick calculation for something we were doing at the time. And this wasn't when did it come out? Did I say 85? So the period when I used it would have not been until the mid-90s was my exposure to it, and it was literally in passing. And I've been backwards and forwards since then. I mean, obviously I did the, you've seen other videos, I did the Harvard CS50 course. So I would have revisited C at that point. But in terms of using it, as I like to say, in anger, or in some sort of development environment beyond me just durdling around, there's only been one instance for C. And any specifically object-orientated C I've done, or C++, it's been largely just to experiment with that. There's QBasic, which I've already mentioned. First appeared in 91. So Erlang, this is probably the most recent language I've attempted to learn. So this came out in 86. And I learned this because it was in the 7 Languages in 7 Weeks book, but I had to sort of put a halt to it because it was so different in terms of just the approach, I suppose, that I had to sort of just stop momentarily, even though it's inspired by a lot of stuff influenced by a lot of things I've dealt with, like, for instance, Prolog. I recently was messing about in Prolog as part of the 7 languages in 7 weeks and loved it and really was able to get my head around it. But for some reason, I really struggled with Erlang initially. And I think basically because, I wanted to learn the stuff that it's really strong on, and I could understand the pattern matching bit and the whole immutability, functional programming, but I really wanted to properly understand stuff to do with distributed networks, full the distributed nature of it, the high availability, the fault tolerance, all the sort of hot swapping, that sort of stuff. And so I've had to sort of take a deeper dive in order to sort of try and push forward and get around to doing an episode for the Learn to Code, Code to Learn series. So I'm still trying to get my thoughts together on Erlang, how to put it across, if you like, because that was the key thing. Is there were elements of it that I could understand, but I felt very limited in my ability to explain properly the advantages of Erlang and the best way to do it in keeping with idiomatic aspects for Erlang when explaining it to somebody else, which is obviously super important when you're trying to do that. But yeah, fascinating one to look at, its origins and all sorts of things. I've become quite enthralled by it. Well, initially sort of was a bit of a shock and thinking, well, maybe I'll just skip over this. But as I got more into it, and the idea of, with the sort of message passing, and it's good in the 7 languages in 7 weeks book. I do like, it wasn't a failing on the part of that book at all. It was just me not really fully understanding the way of thinking I needed to think for Erlang. Because in the 7 languages in 7 weeks, it builds nicely on what's gone before. So, I can see with the message passing stuff, I can see it helped me understanding or learning about I/O in the book, and the pattern matching, learning about Prolog, and learning about the other languages that are in there, like Scala and stuff like that. So yeah, and of course learning Erlang opens you up to exploring other stuff on the Beam, so Elixir and Gleam more recently. And I think I've mentioned before, I really love the self-documentation program that you can use. So that's something I want to properly explore. And then in 87 we have Perl. So this is one where I've got this weird thing with Perl. I have a book that I bought in the 2000s about Perl and CGI. And it was around the time when I was doing a web applications development certificate with the Open University, which was about 6 units basically. And we didn't specifically learn Perl, I don't remember. But for some reason, I decided to learn Perl in the context of CGI. And I still can't remember why. And I did revisit Perl about 2 years ago and started going through it again. I'd sort of had this programming project at the time where I was sort of going through and independently learning or looking at a programming language every month, like a different one, based on the Stack Overflow results for a certain year, I think. and Perl had come up, so I thought, I should revisit that. And I did dabble again. But I'm just at a loss to find any meaningful code I've ever written in Perl. But clearly I must have done something, because I can't quite work out why I would have gone down the CGI route. My guess is that it was around the same time when I was using PHP, and I was doing a lot of server-side coding, which was part of the course in other technologies, and Perl must have come up at some point there, and I decided it was a worthwhile sub-quest at the time, but I just don't remember the quest very well. And then finally, in 89, another one that I'm sort of aware of and had dabbled a little bit in, but not to any great degree, but I thought I'd bring it up anyway, is Bash. So this shell program and command line, which developed for the GNU project. So it's like a free software alternative for the Bourne shell. And default login shell for numerous Linux systems. So if you played around in Linux, as I have done, then you probably come across, well, most certainly come across Bash. So at some point, and it was fairly recently, I did play around a little bit with Bash stuff, but not to the same degree that I've had to play around with what's the Microsoft PowerShell? That's it. Microsoft PowerShell and Microsoft batch files, was going back to in the day, and the whole stuff you can do in DOS, like DOS scripting language stuff. That's what I'm more familiar with. But yeah, I did dabble around with Bash a little bit. Probably more to do installations of programming language related stuff, actually. Well, I had to issue commands to basically build certain things or install certain stuff in Unix. And while quite a lot of that is fairly easy to do, there have been some instances where I've had to sort of roll my sleeves up a bit and start really digging deep. Yeah, so it mentions about a syntax reminiscent of Perl. And you can see here, I find that a lot of these command line scripting languages have a similar-ish look to them in some respects. And if anybody watching this, can remember a time in when would it be, like late 80s, but more for me in the early 90s, of spending endless amounts of time writing DOS batch files to get the memory to work properly if you wanted to play your favourite game. I don't know if anybody remembers that. Was it in AutoExec BAT and config SYS? I had a whole book, one of those little dummies guide on memory management of how to configure the DOS, those in particular, to do certain things and create batch files where I could have a menu-based system to use either to boot to Windows or early Windows, or to boot to a DOS prompt in a form in which the memory would be managed correctly so I could run a particular game I wanted to play. Fun and games. Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it, that the sort of reasons for learning command language back then were quite different. A lot of the times it was, learning DOS batch files and scripts and stuff like that because you needed to get a game to play properly. And some of them came with their own programs which would modify AutoExec.bat and config SYS. And then I can remember doing things like having to modify them to basically run certain mice or hardware. And other times, I don't know if anybody, again, going back that far, remembers having to get expansion cards to play nice together, and doing some stuff with I'm trying to remember what it was called now. So you don't even think about this nowadays, but there were certain things you had to do because what is it, IRQs? Was that what it was called? To get into share? Yeah, because there's only so many IRQs and various other things, and certain port references as well, to do with the COM port and LPT1 and LPT2 and that sort of stuff. So whenever I think of batch languages, command languages, I always think of those heady days of spending, hours or days pulling your hair out to get certain things to work on your DOS machine. Let's say, yeah. So Bash is the one for Linux and Unix and Unix-like operating systems, but it's also available on Windows and BIOS. Anyway, that's all I really wanted to talk about in this episode. I'll include links to all of this, including information about that book if you're interested. But like I said, when this video goes out, few days later, within about, I don't know, a week, I'll put out a video and I'll go through this book a little bit. Thanks for watching. Bye for now. And I will catch you in a future video.